Good morning. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us for this Tenants' Rights, our climate change issue webinar. My name is Serena Unrein, and I'm with the Arizona Partnership for Healthy Communities, which is managed by LISC Phoenix. We are really excited to kick off this year's Arizona Partnership for Healthy Communities webinar series, which is sponsored by Arcos Health and co-presented this morning by Wildfire. Once a quarter, we'll bring together practitioners from various sectors to discuss best practices, share data, and talk about policies to help improve community health. This year's series explores critical topics at the intersection of health, equity, and sustainability through the lens of climate change. We are co-hosting today's online forum with Wildfire, and this amazing panel will be discussing how climate change impacts communities in multifaceted ways, and we will discuss actionable solutions to enhance tenants' rights while mitigating climate change impacts. A few things to note before we get into the conversation today. You can see us, but we can't see you, but you are an important part of this conversation. So please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. It's great to see people from around Arizona engaging, and great to know where all of you are from and what organizations you're representing. We are also going to be here to answer your questions. So please submit any questions you have using the Q&A function, and use the chat to engage with other audience members and share resources and links. We will be recording this webinar and sending out a link to the recording to everyone who registered. And the follow-up email will also include links to our resources that the speakers referenced during today's webinar. I'd like to have each of our panelists introduce themselves so you can get to know them a little bit better. I'll start with you, Claire, and please go ahead and share your name, who you work for, and any helpful background.
Hey everyone, my name is Claire Michael. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Climate Equity Director at Wildfire, which is a statewide organization that works to limit and reduce the causes and consequences of poverty through administering funding to other nonprofits for assistance programs, and then also through advocating for better policies. And so my work at Wildfire specifically focuses on advocating for policies relating to energy affordability issues. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Claire. And I'd like to say that so much of the concept for this webinar really came from Claire's work and her work on climate change issues. So thank you for the inspiration today. Nick, I'll go ahead and have you introduce yourself.
Thank you, Serena. Hi, my name is Nick Bruno. I'm a member of the Tucson Tenants Union, and I've been here part of their organization for over 3 years now. And what we do is we go pretty much block by block, building to building, as well as, to any of the tenants that reach out to us around town that are interested in trying to address both their living conditions on the personal level, but more so focusing on connecting with their neighbors, fellow tenants, to build tenant power, fight for, fit and habitable housing against landlord abuses, harassment, exploitation, and ultimately towards a world with homes for all. And because of that, we have an expanded definition of tenants where we also include unhoused people, people that are not in control of their housing. So if they're still paying mortgages to banks, as well as incarcerated and other, state institutions of housing. And so it's a pretty wide array, but on top of that, we're also nationally connected in networks like Right to the City Alliance, which has over 90 member organizations. And we are an observer of the Autonomous Tenant Union Network, though we're not an official member. And that's dozens of other tenant unions across the continent. So thanks, I'm glad to be here.
Thanks, Nick. We're glad to have you here today. And last but not least, joining us from DC, Steve, go ahead and introduce yourself.
First of all, thank you all for allowing me to invade the state and be a part of this conversation. I'm Steve Glaude. I'm the president and CEO of the Coalition for Nonprofit Housing and Economic Development in Washington, D.C. We're made up, or a cluster organization made up of 100 nonprofits and about 70 mission-driven for-profits that work across the footprints of homelessness, affordable housing, workforce development, small business development, and human services. All of the tenant advocacy organizations are members of ours, and they rely on us to kind of convene them and advance their both policy and budget asks for the District of Columbia, as well as just to track trends that are impacting tenants. A couple of the things that we're known for, our Housing for All campaign was launched about 14 years ago, and it resulted in the district investing $1.5 billion in affordable housing over the last 9 years. And also, we were the first city, I believe, to have a Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, which is a law that requires that tenants are fully engaged and actually offered the right to purchase any multifamily housing building that sells in the District of Columbia. It's good to be here.
It's good to have you here. Thank you to the three of you for joining us this morning. Just a reminder to the audience, please engage and ask any questions, share any thoughts you might have, put the questions in the Q&A box, and then put any ideas or recommendations or links that you might have in the chat. Before we get into any questions, I'd like to go ahead and have us level set this conversation and have Claire start with an explanation of why tenants' rights are a climate change issue.
Yes, thank you, Serena. If you want to start sharing that presentation, I'll go through some stats from there. But tenant rights are a climate change issue for several reasons. But as someone who spends most of my job looking at energy affordability issues in Arizona, that lens is kind of how I came to this own conclusion in relation to my work. So in the US, 20% of greenhouse gas emissions come from residential energy use. But this is a problem that already has some evidence-based solutions. For example, a study in Arizona showed that implementing energy efficient solutions in single-family homes could cut energy usage by 18%. That's a big deal in terms of savings on utility bills and less pollution. However, this solution is something Arizona renters are not entitled to under CART laws. In situations where they may be tangentially entitled to it through building codes, there is limited enforcement. And in all of these cases, tenants assume all the responsibility and risk and try to hold their landlord accountable to their rights. And so we also can't forget the human impact. If you want to go to the next slide. So the human impact of climate change beyond emissions. Last year in Arizona, we experienced record-breaking heat, and that trend is likely to continue, which means spending more to keep your home at a safe temperature. And this is something that continues to disproportionately affect energy insecure households who pay on average 27% more per square foot for energy than others. And when looking at renters compared to owners, regardless of income, renters are paying 29% more per square foot. And even among the lowest income renters and owners, renters were paying 13% more per square foot for energy. This indicates a very significant energy efficiency gap between renters and owners, regardless of income. And energy efficiency is not something renters have agency to change when it comes to their unit. That is a landlord responsibility and something renters are in often cases barred from doing anything about. So next slide. Tenants' rights are a climate change issue in terms of reducing the emissions contributing to climate change, but also in terms of better protecting our most vulnerable households from the consequences of climate change through energy affordability, which in turn impacts public health, community resilience, and a range of social issues. And as we spend or as we utilize more energy to cool our homes in the face of extreme heat in Arizona, for example, that only increases energy bills both on an individual basis, but on a grid-wide basis. And so there's lots of reasons tenant rights are a climate change issue, but this is kind of the overview from my perspective of how I got here. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire, for introducing this topic and for sharing why this is such an important issue, particularly for those who are renting properties, because there are clearly some challenges and burdens that are unique to renters. So I'd like to have Nick and then Steve go ahead and chime in and share from your unique perspectives. When you think of tenants' rights, how do you see those rights intersecting with climate change issues?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, Claire really laid a good foundation for us, because the things that she highlighted, in terms of habitability with limited enforcement of the codes, the high risk of trying to, hold landlords accountable or advocate for ourselves as tenants, and just renters or tenants not having even like a say in the matter at all. Those are all things that, like, at the base level, if we're trying to set, further, preparations for being like climate ready, or just like to be able to handle adversity, we need to have those foundations, like, laws for habitability, rights to organize. And also that would mean like just cause evictions, so that if, somebody's trying to get, heat protections, or like get their AC fixed, or, just any sort of, attempts like that, they don't get retaliated against. Um, and I think that those go into other things too, in terms of like, if we start visioning for like what we could have a say in, if we're thinking about like, um, in a kind of a resiliency model, if we have like hubs of, tenants, like in a tenants union, we have associations, and the associations start at the building level and can go to the landlord or level, or the local area, to the whole, citywide level. But thinking about that in terms of climate preparedness, we're needing to coordinate, especially when we have, issues that affect entire regions, um, especially like in Arizona, our needs with like heat and water, um, being some of the most. But I mean, I can imagine, if we're looking at something for, a federal like level of policy to try and have something, and maybe Steve can say more about this, but we've seen disasters in other areas like hurricanes, tornadoes, things like that, where we need that higher level of kind of organization, or at least some more focus on empowering those tenants in place in the communities, both to give them the most like adaptive, uh, flexibility, because they know their needs, but also to, prioritize, either keeping those communities resilient, keeping them together, allowing them to really like withstand and not just be completely displaced, in an emergency. Um, and yeah, I guess the only thing that I can others say otherwise, in terms of my personal experience here, is why I got into the tenants union myself, which was at the beginning of the pandemic. Um, it was, a public health crisis. I mean, it still is, but we've come to manage it somewhat. um, and I wasn't able to continue making my wages the same rate that I was. And because of that, I was one of the millions that were at risk of eviction, that, through popular, pressure and, some higher level decision making, they enacted the moratoriums. But, those were different across, states, and even across, cities and within the states and counties. Um, so thinking about, if we're finding ourselves in a crisis, and what we determined that to be, having freezes on, collecting rents, evictions on moratoriums, reductions, or, even state intervention in provisions of utilities. These are all, really necessary things that we need to look at, especially like, as these, sort of issues are only going to be more pressing for us in the future, both with climate and migration and things like that. So I'd love to hear, Steve, your perspective on this.
I appreciate what both Claire and Nick have said. And I think in part what it comes down to is how do we care for tenants through this time of change? But it also means how do we care for the people and the organizations who care for tenants? So most organizations that educate and advocate and inform and deal directly with tenants, they don't really have climate change subject matter experts on their staffs. And yet there's a need to almost begin to do that. And the question becomes, how does the ecosystem around these organizations actually support that? So unfortunately, philanthropy doesn't always move as nimbly and as fast as it can. But I can envision in the future where we'll see RFPs from foundations to say, you can use this money to get climate change expertise on your staff. In DC, I'll just use as an example, so much of our housing stock was not really built for the housing conditions that the climate conditions that we are facing and going to face even more. And so part of it comes down to how do we look at, and I kind of use this framing, and I said this in our planning call, whenever there's a big societal mover, vulnerable communities and under-resourced organizations are generally the last, they're the trailers in the trends, in the compliance issues, in the resource opportunities, and that leaves tenants more vulnerable and more exposed. And there is a really comprehensive kind of ecosystem need. So for example, it's not just about climate, it's also about resiliency compliance and sustainability. And so this is such a bad analogy, but it's kind of like a perfect storm in some ways, because we have climate change happening in and of itself. But then we also have mandates, things like, net zero, carbon emissions, and other things that are impacting tenants. And I'll give you only one concrete example. We have a building in DC that's trying to convert to a more sustainable energy grid. It is going to ultimately save tenants about $100 a month in utility bills. But it means for the first time in their lives, instead of having their utility covered in their rent, they're going to be responsible for their own individual meters. And the advocates are digging in and saying, this is a dramatic change for them. Lost in the sight of it a little bit is the fact that it's actually going to make their building more efficient and their bills lower, but there was no thought given to, do we educate tenants on how to take care of their own bills to get them to this better place? So I think it is about, I think it is a right. I think we are generally, the tenants that we tend to care about, lower income persons and more vulnerable communities, are generally the last to be informed, the last to be compliant, the last to be resourced. And then how do we, as advocates on their behalf, really equip ourselves to protect them, but to also prepare them? So I think there's a lot of work to do. I think, the tenants have to be the primary focus, but I also want to lift up that those caring for tenants need support and need investment and need equipping so that they can do a better job of doing it.
All really great points, and thank you all for sharing your perspectives and thinking about some of the ways that tenants' rights are impacted by climate change. So I think we started to go there. Nick had some ideas about some of the solutions that we saw during the pandemic, and I really appreciate Steve sharing that, we need to think about tenants, but also the organizations that work with tenants. But are there any solutions that you're excited about that would improve tenants' rights, but also have an impact on climate change? Because I think we saw really clearly in Claire's slide that energy expenditures are much higher for those who are energy insecure. So clearly there's this, like Steve said, it's a perfect storm. There's this terrible instance where, you're already energy insecure and then you're paying even more for energy. So that's going to increase energy emissions. So what are some of the solutions that we can start to look toward that you all are excited about? And Claire, not to pick on you again first, but maybe I'll start with you because I know Wildfire's been doing a lot of work in this space.
I mean, there's lots of solutions. I think for one, I love to look at other places to see what kind of laws or programs, campaigns they've enacted to understand what's working. And one of the things I've come across is that some states require landlords or property owners to share either an energy use disclosure or an energy efficiency rating statement before someone commits to buying or renting a property. And that creates a lot of transparency and ability for renters, in particular for this conversation, to make informed decisions on what property to rent, and can look at that energy efficiency and cost of energy. And I think in Arizona, I always think about our political landscape and how sometimes requiring those types of things may be a multi-year effort, if not longer. And so I think also looking at how to maybe change those kind of policies into programs or campaigns to get a landlord involvement, to maybe start to build that political will to change state law. Or to adopt a local ordinance instead of state level. I think there's also work that our housing advocate Maxine is doing related to mobile home issues that we're running a bill right now that would essentially require manufactured park owners to allow the manufactured homeowners to put in essentially energy efficient commercial cooling technologies like a window AC unit and things like that, that if passed will be really important for the health and safety of manufactured homeowners across Arizona. And so I think there's a lot of common sense solutions in that space that could have a really significant impact.
I would say that, and this is not a technical solution, Serena, and I think that's what you were in part intending to. I want to just lift up the issue of tenant agency in this. I think that that's really important. I don't think we have a lack of know-how, nor do I think we have a lack of resource. I think what we tend to lack is political will. And so one of the solutions is having an informed, educated, and organized tenant base. Let's be honest, politicians as well as industry leaders, they react to that when they see it in front of them. I have witnessed moments where my city council was clearly headed in a certain direction on something, and then 200 advocates and residents showed up at City Hall and the vote flipped just like that. I think that it's a different lens for the industry. The industry tends to look at it more through a consumer lens, but I think there's consumer power. If tenants have agency in their existence and their futures, they can ensure that the resources as well as the technology that's available. In DC, I'm seeing more and more green rooftops in our downtown footprint. I mean, and that's what leads me to say, I don't think we have a lack of know-how how to do it. I will lift up one other thing that I'm witnessing as a trend. We're developing a younger and younger developer base in DC, and they are much more open to the idea of both construction and rehabilitating buildings for the future. And so they're more apt to do grid conversions and solar and other things. And so one of the solutions is really developing a younger developer base. And so that as people move into real estate, a younger base of people, they're just more naturally inclined to futuristic thinking and future technologies. And so we're trying to be intentional about cultivating that younger developer base, because they're just, it's closer to their being in their DNA than some old guy like me. And so we are really encouraging that. And I think a young developer industry can be part of the solution as well. Not a technical answer, but I think relevant to the future as we hope to construct it.
All solutions welcome. So thank you. Sorry. Go ahead, Nick.
No, thank you. I was just gonna say I want to build on both of those, like from Claire and Steve. Those are all great. And yeah, there's so many more that I could kind of share. But kind of getting back to that tenant agency. One of the things that I was just kind of coming back to, I mean, among a few, was the like kind of a way of having a tenant role in taking stock of what is kind of currently existing. Like if we take a survey of the vacant, units, if we take a survey of how the land is being used, how like basically rents and prices are being set across, and have a way for that to be an engaging kind of format with tenants, because like we were just seeing here in Arizona, maybe y'all saw it, the attorney general just sued like a whole handful or more of these corporate landlords that were price fixing, right? There's a lot of tenant power just inherently in people's abilities that we're not able to really access just because of our position. And I think that what Steve was getting at too, where tenant unions or the tenant movement is not necessarily going to be the one that makes the decision, about the climate policy, but it's a school of raising that that class consciousness, of raising up our political education, to learning about what the issues are that are affecting us, and that gives tenants a much more direct say in the conditions over their lives than maybe at a policy level, but that the policy level ultimately we're able to start to affect. Because one of the models that we're trying in the tenants union here in Tucson is from our building associations, picking leaders that would then be able to go into these higher levels of government, whether it's even just from the building level to the neighborhood level, or then, trying to get into, like the city council, just to be, having more influence, from amongst our base, because we are, first building that people power. But then I guess the other things I was wanting to say was about, kind of bringing in some of the like other things that we could do proactively, because there's restrictions not only on rent control and on things like that, but also on public housing at the federal level with, the Faircloth Amendment. Is that what it is? There's got to be ways that we could look into, preserving and retrofitting and then expanding public housing existing as it is, because that's the truly affordable housing. And then for everybody else that's still renting, having proactive rental inspections, so that it's not a burden onto the tenants to initiate that process. And there's a little bit more stepping in from the government level. But I mean, something that we've found along the way is that our code enforcement only has less than 10 people in it for the city. And there's my dog. So there's yeah, it's like a multi-scale like thing that we're needing to look at. Some other things that I was thinking about in terms of like the tenant involvement in like kind of local resiliency and adaptation. I was thinking about also in the public health aspect, because one thing that we've been trying to organize with not only tenants but our partnering organizations is like these crisis hubs, right? Like at the beginning of the pandemic, we formed in different neighborhoods like hubs of mutual aid, where people would be able to help make sure that everybody got fed, everybody got necessary supplies. If people were needing any order of support like transportation, things like that. I think this is where, if we have incorporate public health workers into these networks, and into, something like we see in other places around the world where like, every, neighborhood has a doctor, and things like that. You know, we're getting there. I've been seeing, like, at least in some aspects, expansions of, like our healthcare centers, but I think that really making those sorts of accessible on the ground would be great. And especially if we're looking at, kind of locally driven things. And then also, before I go too long, the other kind of components of housing is like where the housing is situated, right? So pushing for things like free and reliable, frequent transportation that's public, having local food cultivation. I learned just, the other day that Yuma produces like 90% of like the cold weather lettuce for the entire country. That blew my mind. And I was just like, wow, like we could really provide for ourselves a lot here, like especially, as they do for the entire country. And then I was, when Claire was bringing up the mobile home parks, I was thinking about particularly our undocumented tenants, because they're highly populated in mobile home parks. And I think that any of our policies need to make special provisions for, protecting our undocumented folks here, and, thinking about how our border policies just in general have contributed to this climate crisis. The most blaring thing that I can think of is how water usage in constructing the border wall, quickly depleted, aquifers all along. And so now, it's like where we were at before, where we were saying, oh, we have to limit our water usage, and we're, pumping millions of gallons, to do something that's, ultimately just for show. We gotta make sure that, like, if the people could, have that say in how, these local resources are used, and especially also, connecting in the indigenous, rights and things like that, as we know that those are under attack. That's got to be part of, when we're talking about tenants' rights, situating ourselves on this land as well. So I will pass it along. Thanks for letting me take up so much time.
We want to have a great conversation and hear everyone's perspective. So thank you for those thoughts, Nick. And I wanted to just highlight something before I move on to the next question. Nick had pointed out some of the opportunities for public health to engage with some of the tenants organizing happening in, not just in Arizona, but anywhere. So I know we have a lot of people from a public health background in the audience. So I would encourage you all to chime in with your thoughts or ideas in the chat. And I just wanted to take a moment to remind the audience that you can absolutely ask questions and pop them in the chat or the Q&A function, because we want to hear from you. And I see that we have a question, and I will get to it. And first, I'm going to just ask our panelists, because I think we've talked a lot about this connection between tenants' rights and climate change, but especially for Steve and Nick, since they work so closely with tenants and tenants organizations, to what extent are tenants thinking about climate change, and is that a priority for them? Or are we at this time where rent is so high and the cost of living has become so unaffordable that is really, that thinking about pricing and affordability are really first and foremost in people's minds before anything else? Or are climate change issues top of mind as well for tenants? And I'll let either one of you share your thoughts. Go ahead, Steve.
I'll dive in quick. I think it cuts two ways. I think for tenants who are responsible for their own utilities, they are definitely thinking or beginning to think about it. If they have to use more energy in the summer to cool and more energy in the winter to heat, then they're a little more connected to it. I would argue that many tenants, at least in DC's footprint, are more concerned with building conditions than they are climate. I don't think that they are aware DC is in a unique period where we have a new unit production goal for housing in DC. And so most of our resources are going into buildings with 250 units or more. So our mid-sized buildings, 5 to 49 unit buildings, are not getting the money to do repairs, to get up to code and so forth. And I would say that many of our tenants are kind of consumed with that. And I think this is partly where it comes down to what each of us has said around really educating tenants around climate as an issue and how it impacts them. I'm not sure many, other than saying the winters are colder or the summers are hotter, I'm not sure how many tenants connect their quality of life to climate change, unless you're in an exacerbated area where, like, I mean, in DC, it's changing. I grew up here. We used to get snow in October, and by January 15th, it was warm. We now don't get snow till January, and it doesn't warm until May. It's now shifting again, where I'm not even sure we're having winters. And so we're just really paying attention to what it's doing to housing stock and utility. And I think it goes back to the issue of education and, again, the communities we care about lagging in information. Experientially, I will say, I don't think it's pervasively in the awareness of tenants, but I do think our tenant educating organizations are doing an increasingly better job of making them aware of it. So I think there will be an emergence of tenant awareness in the years to come that is just beginning to show its head right now.
Yeah, and I want to kind of go off of that I think it's kind of both an emergence and also a legacy, because in thinking about like kind of like what options are open to tenants right now, obviously, like, it's going to be keep the doors closed, keep the temperature at this much, if you can, but there's also like again, if we are trying to look at like where the places are situated, like these complexes that are in Amphi neighborhood, and tenants there are looking around and saying like, it would be great to have more trees in our neighborhood because it's just hot streets and there's no shade. That's climate awareness. It would be great to be able to have a community garden in this patch that's just barren, and that's like tenants seeing that there's opportunities and seeing that they have things that are priorities ultimately, not only for just the sake of community building, but for their own sustenance, things like that. That if we also look into kind of the broader things, like historically there's tenant awareness about pollution in the water from entire areas of the city around the Air Force Base. I feel like that is like a both a tenant site of struggle that is ongoing, and trying to hold the military accountable to get reparations for all of the people who have gotten cancer or died over the years, who are still being poisoned by that water, and those are just like some of the things that like we make entryways into this broader discussion about being able to set our own course in adapting to the needs that we're faced with in terms of climate challenges. So again, that brings it back to tenant movement really being a site of political education struggle, and really like just that opportunity for people who getting the whole context of where we're living as well. So yeah.
Thanks, Nick. Really, really thoughtful insight from both of you there. And I like that framing of thinking it as climate awareness, that even if, tenants aren't thinking about the direct impacts of climate change. They know, for example, that there aren't enough trees to provide adequate shade in their neighborhood. So I think that's a really insightful answer. Thank you. I wanted to get to the question that Alejandra asked in the chat, that asking if there are any incentives available for landlords that are willing to do green infrastructure. So Claire, if I could rely on your expertise again and see what kind of incentives there might be for landlords.
Yeah, so I would say primarily there's the Weatherization Assistance Program, which is a federally funded program for low-income households, which includes renters. There's some significant barriers, though. The program is underfunded. Landlords must agree to both the weatherization and agree to not raise rents more than a reasonable amount over a period of time. But there's not a lot of specifically renter geared programs. There's a lot of rebates coming down with the different like bipartisan infrastructure law, but a lot of those don't cover the full cost. I will say I'll put a link in the chat to ACEEE on their energy equity for renters. They have a lot of really good resources, and I think one of the big gaps they've identified across the nation, but also identified as a strength in some places, is developing programs specifically for renters when it comes to energy equity. It's really important that these programs are geared directly to renters in order to have that kind of level of effectiveness for these issues.
And I just put a resource in the chat for our BEPS, our Building Energy Performance Standards, and that is a mandate in DC, but it has come with resources, and I believe it is a resource that landlords can use to get up to code and in compliance.
Great. Thank you both for those resources and those answers. We'll be sure to include those links in the resource email that comes out afterwards. I also wanted to build off of that question, and thank you for asking that question in the chat, Alejandra, to think about what our current housing infrastructure is at. I think I might have a guess about what your answers will be based on our conversation thus far, but is our current housing stock climate ready? And if it isn't, what do we need to do to prepare our housing stock, particularly our housing stock that's available to renters, to be climate ready? Because I'm guessing, based on Claire's slides earlier, we have some improvements to do, especially when it comes to energy efficiency, but probably some other things too. So what changes would you all make?
If I can jump in, I would love to see eminent domain actually used for the public's use. Because historically we've seen eminent domain used to displace communities, doing things like creating interstate highways and convention centers. But what we have come across, especially in a lot of our organizing in town, are slumlords that know that, like, maybe they are particularly preying on vulnerable populations, or they invested in a property thinking that they'll get high turnaround college students, but then they ended up getting low income people of color that are there, and just decided to not invest in keeping the property up. And so we're facing years past due of updates and keeping buildings up to code. And some of the threat there of trying to organize and advocate for fit and habitable housing is code enforcement could come in and just either condemn the building and then displace the tenants, which we had that problem in one of our building campaigns. Y'all probably have heard about it. It's based on the access scam, the Medicaid being used for the bogus substance rehabilitation, where they, got people off the street, got them, signed up through Access, and a lot of them with tribal, using tribal identifications, and just took the money and gave them no services. But, the contradiction there is that they were housed for, a few months or a period of time. And then when we tried to go in and advocate for, their rights as tenants, the management actually used the city's law about condemning the building to get everybody out once, the scam money got busted and dried up. So, then we're facing, a bigger problem than we started with. So yeah, if in that situation, just like in some of these others, eminent domain was used, and, actually was able to, take control of the building, make the improvements that were needed, keep the people in place, or at least finding a temporary solution for them to then be able to come back, and then, be able to provide the services that they were trying to access in the first place. That's just like, not even a revolutionary thought. Like that's we should be doing that, right? When it comes to other slumlords and things like that, we're trying to find really creative ways of kind of going about making them do their repairs. One of them, most recently in South Tucson, being using the crime-free housing policies, where because the landlord, didn't have, proper security lights, or, cameras, or, anybody on watch, fencing, left broken windows for extended periods of time, that it was actually those conditions that contributed to, more crime and things like that in the area than, the tenants themselves. And I mean, that's another thing that just like in our narrative, it's not necessarily a policy change, but it's more so our kind of struggle on the ground, is that we have to take control of that narrative, that, any problem that we're facing with housing is the tenant's problem, rather than, putting the blame where it belongs. So that's going to just be an ongoing thing, because even in our like more cut and dry, slam dunk, battles, they're still trying to blame everything on, point to each other, divide us, stop any sort of cohesive movement from growing, try to cut tenants off from outside support. But yeah, we're not going to stop. And once people are, kind of aware of what's going on and how they're being treated, it only spreads. So sometimes the retaliation only contributes to the tenant power movement. So we thankful for our enemies.
Thanks, Nick. Any other thoughts on housing stock readiness for climate change? Because we can.
So I'll
go
just
ahead.
go back and I'll keep this real. I don't think that we don't know how to do the things we want to do. I think it's a matter of political will, and then what kind of city state do we want to have? And so when you look at tenants' roles in this, I encourage our people to be politically and electorally active. I think to sustain a movement over time, you got to throw some people out of office and you got to put some people in office. And there's just no way to dance around it. And then hold people accountable. I don't think we lack the technology. I don't think we lack the know-how. I don't think we lack the industry innovation or the money. I just think it's a matter of values. So, one of the things that we push for is smarter and compassionate growth. We believe in a growth model for our city, but we don't want to look up and see that we've lost. We just had an Urban Institute study released last year. DC lost another 15% of its African-American population over the last 10 years. And when you look at where they come from this housing stock that is not being kept up to code. And what's interesting is we're a rent control city. So we're not losing people because of rent pressures. We are actually losing Black and brown families who are becoming economically mobile. If you live in a substandard building and you get a raise or you get a job, suddenly that broken elevator bothers you. And once you know you're on a sustained economic growth path, you aspire for better living conditions, better neighborhoods, better schools, and better buildings. But you still can't compete in the DC housing market. So if you got to get out that building because it's not being tended to, because of a lack of political will, you're going to move to the suburbs. And that's why we've lost. I think this replays itself in city across America. And so I think tenants have to be visible, they have to be vocal, they have to be organized, and they have to at sometimes take action. And that action is more than just protesting at City Hall or the state capitol. In some cases, it means putting people in and taking people out of office. So I just think this work we do to educate tenants helps create a balanced scale for those who want to have a diverse community, a diverse city, a diverse state.
Thanks, Steve. Claire, I think you might have had one. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Nick.
No, go ahead, Claire. I'll go after.
I'm sorry, Claire, if I cut you off. I didn't mean to.
You're all good. I was just gonna say, I mean, I second a lot of what both Nick and Steve were saying, so I won't repeat them. But I did throw the study in the chat of what I was referencing earlier of a very technical of what energy efficiency could look like in Arizona, really high impact energy efficiency. And that link I sent is interactive. So if you click on the different solutions, you can see kind of stats and definitions and things like that. So that I find it very helpful.
Thanks, Claire. Nick, go ahead and chime in.
Yeah, I'd love to check that out. Yeah, I was just going to share a quick link as well about a PBS documentary called Raising Liberty Square about one of the oldest public housing developments in the country is actually in Miami. And they put it as a Black community that was on this raised land where, you know, they thought that, you know, all of the beachfront properties would be the best ones and everybody would want it. But it turns out that Liberty Square was the only one that was storm resilient. And so it actually became later very, very desired. I think that one of the things that I got from that was that also, you know, amongst other things, that we should be trying to show how public housing to, you know, if we're taking, you know, investment in it, put more into it to expand it, that can really be, you know, like it was originally designed, you know, something that it's not just for, you know, for low income people. Everybody should want public housing, right? It shouldn't be a thing that is, you know, culturally, you know, taboo or whatever. It's a point of pride, right? It's a point of like, if we think about like, what is the point of society if not to provide for his people, right? That should be something that we would be glad to try and have. So it's, again, another part of the kind of narrative and kind of like other dynamics of the battle, and being able to like have a policy fight or have the political will. We have to believe that it's worth fighting for, right? So that's just another thing I was thinking about.
Thanks, Nick. I'll reshare that link in just a moment because I think it might have come up before a lot of folks were part of the webinar, and I think that's a great example. We are coming to the end of our hour together to discuss tenants' rights as a climate change issue. So I just wanted to wrap things up and give our panelists an opportunity to share their final thoughts. But first, I wanted to say thank you to the sponsor of this Arizona Partnership for Healthy Communities webinar series for this year, Arcos Health. We really appreciate the sponsorship, which allows us to host these webinars and important discussions. I also wanted to say thank you to our co-host today, Wildfire, and appreciate Wildfire and Claire for all of their help putting this webinar together. And most importantly, I wanted to thank our panelists and our audience for being part of this discussion today, because these conversations don't happen without really thoughtful experts like Steve, Claire, and Nick, and it doesn't happen without a great audience to engage in the chat and share their thoughts and ideas. So thank you all for being here today. And on behalf of the Arizona Partnership for Healthy Communities, we will hope to see you at our next webinar, which will be around heat resiliency, probably taking place in May, and we'll be sure to send out a link to everyone so you can join us for that next discussion. And I will go ahead and give each of our panelists 1 minute to share their final thoughts. We'll go in reverse order of how we did intros. So I'll go Steve, Nick, then Claire. So Steve, go ahead and wrap us up.
And I'll do a minute. I just want to say that you couldn't tell from maybe the tone of my comments or maybe even the panels, but I want to be very clear. We are pro-industry and we are also pro-government. We believe in aligning with sectors as well as financial and philanthropic sectors. We believe in aligning with sectors and bringing solutions. And so I know that when we focus on tenants, there's a tendency to, leave a feeling in the air that you're, opposed to these other sectors. We realize it takes all sectors to kind of move something and address something big like this. So we work with our industry leaders and we work with our government leaders, and we challenge ourselves to come up with solutions so that we can kind of forge ahead together. Thank you.
Yeah, and just basing off of that, the Tenants Union has been partnered with, Old Pueblo Community Services, the ward district offices, with, Catholics Worker Kitchens, Casa Maria, with, specifically working closely with code enforcement, with, all these other, moving parts in the community, as well as other nonprofits and things like that. So, this is a collective effort. We have the tenants out in front. We believe, that obviously homes for all is a value and principle that we hold, but that, at the same time, every, tenant deserves a union, every worker deserves to be part of a union. And that as we're, trying to, get more of that agency for, both the more immediate things, like we were saying at the beginning, to, some of the more long-term kind of like visionary things, think about ways that we can support these other alternatives that would promote tenant agency, like, community land trust, cooperatively owned, mobile home parks, tenant associations being able to negotiate, contracts with their landlords, things like that. And that ultimately, they could play a huge part in building, hubs of resilience, in the face of not only climate crisis, but, any of the crises that our system undergoes. So thank you so much, Claire.
So much that could be said, but I think honestly, just in thinking about this webinar, it's so apparent that tenant rights and climate change are incredibly multifaceted and intersectional issues. While I focused on energy insecurity, I could also talk about how they relate to domestic violence and food insecurity and so many other things. And I really think that these are issues that are going to require a cross-sector solution. And there's power, whether it's at a healthcare insurer or corporation or within the nonprofits and unions or government, there's going to need to be significant collaboration to solve these very intense issues and to develop that political will. But thank you.
Thanks, Claire. I think that's a perfect way to end this webinar, is to have us all thinking about cross-sector collaboration and the role that we can all play in making sure that we are connecting tenants' rights as a climate change issue and doing some really important work for the rest of the day and the rest of the week. So thank you all for being here, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. And my most sincere gratitude to the three of you for joining in this conversation and sharing your insight and wisdom. Take care. Have a great day, everyone.